The Galactic Union Joint Military Academy sat like a crown on top of the station world called Veldron, a massive ring of metal and glass spinning slowly in a light of 3 distant suns. And every cycle it pulled in the best young officers from 100 different species, who all came with the same dream of earning the silver commission badge that would open every door in the galaxy. Cadet Rios Valen stood at the back of the shuttle bay and watched the new arrivals walk through the pressure doors. His 4 thin arms folded tight against his chest in the way his people always stood when they were nervous. And he had every reason to be nervous, because in 3 years at the academy he had learned one truth that no instructor would ever say out loud. The Drenari owned this place, and everyone else was just borrowing space. He was Selvari, a species that most galactic citizens could not even name if you asked them. Reptilian and slender, with scales the color of river, stone, and large dark eyes that missed very little. And his homeworld was a minor client state that sent exactly 2 cadets to the academy every generation. And both of those cadets were expected to keep their heads down and be grateful for the opportunity. Rios had kept his head down for 3 years, and it had worked well enough, but the problem was that he was brilliant, and brilliance had a way of making itself known no matter how quiet you tried to be. The new arrivals came through in clusters, sorted by species. Tall Minari, with their feathered crests, thick-bodied Gorali, who had to duck under the doorframes, and then a small group that made every head in the bay turn and stare. Terrans. There were 6 of them walking in a tight formation that was not quite military, but not quite casual either, as if their bodies simply defaulted to a pattern that said, "We are together, and we are watching." And at the front of the group walked a woman with dark hair pulled back so tight it looked painted onto her skull, gray eyes that swept the room once and seemed to record everything in it, and knuckles that carried scars old enough to have gone white. Her name was Sarah Marin Torres, Cadet First Class of the United Terran Defense Corps, and she was here on an exchange program that was only 3 years old, because humanity itself was only 40 years into its membership in the Galactic Union, which in galactic terms meant they had arrived yesterday. The galaxy did not know what to make of humans yet. They were small by most standards, soft-skinned, breakable in a dozen ways that most species were not, and yet every intelligence briefing about the Terran border conflicts told the same story. Do not corner them, do not push them past their threshold, and above all, do not assume that because they are bleeding, they are finished. Sarah led her group to their assigned barracks without speaking to anyone, and the bay returned to its normal noise. But the energy had shifted in a way that was hard to name. 2 days later, the shift became a crack. The Academy ran war simulation exercises every quarter cycle, massive holographic battles where cadet teams commanded virtual fleets and ground forces against each other. And the rankings from these exercises mattered more than almost anything else, because they decided who got the best commissions after graduation. Senior Cadet Vorath Kalin had won the last 4 exercises in a row, and nobody was surprised, because Vorath was Drenari, and the son of Admiral Kalin, one of the most powerful officers in the entire Union fleet. And Vorath himself was a wall of muscle and tusk, who stood nearly 3 meters tall, and moved through the academy like he already owned it, which in many ways he did. But on this day, the simulation assigned Rios as the opposing team leader, a random selection that the computer made without caring about politics. And for 6 hours, Rios did something that nobody expected. He won. Not by a small margin, but by a devastating one, using a series of feint maneuvers and supply line disruptions that left Vorath chasing shadows, while the real attack came from a direction that should have been impossible. And when the simulation ended, and the scores appeared on the main display board, there was a silence in the command theater that felt like the moment before a detonation. The instructors marked it with professional approval, and one of them, a Minari veteran named Instructor Dahl, actually said the word exceptional out loud, which was the highest praise anyone had heard him give in 20 years. Vorath said nothing, but his tusks ground together with a sound like stones being crushed, and his golden eyes found Rios across the room and held him there. That evening in the mess hall, Sarah Torres sat down across from Rios without asking permission, which was the Terran way of doing things. Tray on the table and said, "That feint you ran through the Kirath Nebula corridor was one of the cleanest tactical moves I have seen in years. Where did you learn to think like that?" Rios stared at her, because in 3 years at the Academy, no one had ever simply sat down with him, and certainly no one had ever spoken to him about his abilities as if they were something to admire rather than something to tolerate. "I read a lot," he said. "Good answer," she said, and she ate her food and talked with him about fleet theory as if he were just another soldier at the table, which was exactly what he was, and exactly what no one else had ever treated him as. He almost smiled. But across the hall at the senior table, Vorath watched them with those golden eyes, and beside him 4 other Drenari cadets leaned in to hear what he was saying, and what he was saying was quiet and precise and full of the kind of cold purpose that turns bruises into policy. Night behind a sealed door in the senior barracks, a group of 12 Drenari cadets met in a room that was supposed to be a storage closet, but had been their meeting place for over a year. And Vorath stood at the center and spoke, not just about the simulation or about the Selvari who had embarrassed him, but about something much larger. He spoke about the future. He spoke about an order that was coming, a return to the way things were supposed to be, before the Union softened everything with its councils and its equality and its pathetic exchange programs that let humans walk the same halls as Drenari warriors. He spoke about his father, and every cadet in that room listened, because what Vorath was describing was not a schoolyard grudge. It was the first stage of a revolution, and it would begin with a message that everyone would understand, the kind of message you pin to a wall. The week after the simulation exercise, the Academy felt different, in a way that was hard to describe to someone who had not grown up inside a system built on silence. But Rios Valen felt it the way his people felt changes in pressure before a storm. Not with any specific sense, but with every cell in his body, telling him that the air had shifted. It started small. His access cards stopped working on the 3rd floor training wing, and when he reported it to administration, they told him it was a system error and it would be fixed, but it was never fixed, and he started taking the long way around through the lower corridors where the lights were dim and the cameras were old. His kit was searched twice in 1 week by senior cadets who said they were doing routine inspections, and both times they left his belongings scattered across the floor of his bunk, and both times the other cadets in his section looked at the mess and looked away. The metal of his locker door in old Drenari script, and when he asked a translator what it meant, the translator went pale and said it was a term used for animals that were bred only to be eaten. Rios said nothing about any of this. He had learned long ago that complaining in a system that did not want to hear you was just a faster way of becoming a target. So he kept his head down, and he went to his classes, and he studied his tactical theory, and he tried very hard to become invisible again. But you cannot become invisible after you have beaten the son of an admiral in front of the entire academy. Instructor Dahl assigned the next training rotation, and placed Rios as the lead tactical advisor for a joint exercise that included cadets from 9 different species. And the assignment was based on merit alone, because Dahl was one of the few instructors who still believed that merit was the point of the academy. Vorath was assigned as second lead, was not in the ranking itself, but in what it meant. A Selvari, a creature from a species that most Drenari considered barely sentient, had been placed above the heir of House Kalon in a military chain of command. And in the old traditions of the Drenari warrior caste, there was no greater humiliation than to kneel before something you considered beneath you. Vorath did not complain either. He simply waited. The evening after the assignment was posted, the academy corridors were quiet because most cadets were in the recreation halls or the study chambers. And Rios was walking alone through the B-wing connector passage near the barracks when he heard footsteps behind him. Heavy, deliberate, and more than one set. He did not turn around because he already knew. Vorath hit him first, a backhand strike across the face that lifted Rios off his feet and sent him spinning into the bulkhead wall with enough force to crack one of his smaller horns. Could slide to the floor. Two more Drenari grabbed his upper arms and held him upright, while a third punched him twice in the midsection. Rios did not scream, because Selvari cannot scream. Their vocal structure does not allow for it. But his body made a sound like air being forced through a broken pipe, and his dark eyes went wide with a pain that was beyond anything he had prepared himself for. "You think you can lead us," Vorath said, and his voice was calm in the way that only truly cruel voices can be calm, as if the violence was not a loss of control, but a carefully chosen tool. "You think because a computer puts your name above mine that it means something?" He grabbed Rios by the throat with one massive hand and lifted him off the ground as easily as a human might lift a coat off a hook. "Let me show you what it means." From a kit bag, one of the Drenari produced a set of structural pinning clamps, heavy magnetic restraints designed to secure cargo. Containers to bulkhead walls during high-gravity maneuvers. And they were never meant to be used on a living body, but that was exactly what Vorath used them for. They spread Rios against the wall and drove the clamps through the fabric of his uniform into the metal, one on each of his 4 wrists, pinning him 3 feet off the ground, with his arms stretched out in a shape that looked like something between a display and a crucifixion. 2 of his arms dislocated at the shoulder, with sounds that echoed down the corridor. Blood ran from his broken horn down the side of his face and dripped onto the floor in a slow rhythm that sounded louder than it should have in the silence. Vorath stepped back and looked at his work the way an artist might look at a finished painting. "Leave him," he said. And they left. Rios hung there. The pain was a living thing inside him, a bright white fire in his shoulders, and a deep red ache in his ribs, and a sharp cold. Nothing in his fingers where the clamps had cut off circulation, and he could not call for help because his voice was a whisper, and the corridor was empty. But it was not empty for long. Cadets passed through the B-wing connector on their way to and from the barracks, and one by one they saw him. A Minari cadet who stopped and stared and then walked faster. A group of Garali who looked at each other and shook their heads and kept moving. A pair of junior Drenari who actually laughed before disappearing around the corner. Everyone saw. No one stopped. Because everyone knew what the clamps meant, and everyone knew whose work this was. And everyone understood that helping the creature on the wall was the same as putting yourself on the wall next to him. And fear is the oldest chain in the galaxy, and it does not care what species you are. Rios closed his eyes, and then he heard boots. Not the heavy thud of Drenari feet, or the soft pad of Minari talons, but the sharp, precise rhythm of Terran military footwear striking metal deck plates. And the rhythm did not slow down, or speed up, or hesitate in any way as it approached. Sarah Torres came around the corner with a towel over her shoulder, and sweat still drying on her neck from a late training session, and she saw him. She stopped. Her gray eyes moved from Rios to the clamps to the blood on the floor, to the security cameras that had been angled away from this section of corridor. And her face did not change expression, because it was already set in the only expression it needed to be, the flat, steady look of someone who was processing information and converting it directly into action. She walked to him. "Do not," Rios whispered, and his voice was barely a sound. "They will come for you." Sarah looked at him for exactly 1 second. Then she pulled a multi-tool from her belt and began cutting the first clamp. An alarm triggered somewhere in the station's systems because the clamps were registered equipment, and removing them without authorization sent an alert to the security office. And Sarah did not stop, and she did not look up, and she did not care. She cut the second clamp and caught his upper body as it sagged forward. She cut the third and fourth, and he collapsed against her, and he weighed almost nothing because the Selvarai were a light-boned people. And Sarah was a Terran who had grown up under Earth gravity, and had carried wounded soldiers across broken ground more than once in her life. She lifted him. She carried him through the main concourse of the academy, not through the back corridors or the maintenance tunnels, but through the center where everyone could see, cadets and instructors and administrative staff. And she left a trail of Selvarai blood on the polished floor that stretched from B-Wing all the way to the medical bay. No one stopped her. Everyone saw. She filed an official report with the Commandant's office within the hour, a detailed account with timestamps and a request for a formal investigation. And Commandant Alvarez read it and called it a cadet dispute and buried it in a file that would never be opened. Sarah sat outside the medical bay on a metal bench with her hands resting on her knees, and there was blood on her fingers and on her uniform and in the creases of her palms. And she stared at the far wall with eyes that were no longer processing information. They had already finished processing. What was behind those gray eyes now was something else entirely. A decision that had been made in the time it took to walk around a corner and see a boy hanging from a wall. A decision that did not require anger or outrage or any of the emotions that other species expected from humans. It was quieter than that. It was the thing that happened inside a Terran when they saw something that was wrong, and understood that no one else was going to make it right. A Minari orderly walked past and glanced at her, and later described what he saw to a colleague in words that would eventually become part of the official record of what happened on Veldron. She was not angry, he said. She was not sad. She was not afraid. She was just sitting there and deciding something. And I have studied humans long enough to know that when a Terran goes quiet like that, you should start making plans to be somewhere else. Inside the medical bay, Rios slept under sedation while machines worked to reset his dislocated arms. Outside the medical bay, Sarah Torres cleaned the blood from her hands and began to plan. 3 days after Sarah carried Rios through the main concourse, the galaxy changed. And it changed the way galaxies always change, not slowly and not gently, but all at once like a bone snapping under weight that had been building for years. The first sign was the communications blackout. At exactly the 6th hour of the station cycle, every external channel on Veldron went dead. News feeds, personal comms, Union military frequencies, civilian traffic, all of it gone in the space of a heartbeat. And for 30 seconds the entire academy held its breath, while the overhead lights flickered once and then came back on with a color that was wrong, a deep amber that every military-trained cadet recognized as lockdown protocol. The second sign was the boots in the corridors. Drenari cadets, not 5 or 10, but dozens of them, moved through the academy in coordinated squads, wearing sidearms that cadets were never authorized to carry. And they moved with a precision that made it clear this was not improvised. This had been rehearsed. This had been planned for months or maybe years, while everyone else was busy pretending that the cracks in the system were just cosmetic. The third sign was Vorath's voice on the intercom. "Attention all personnel of the Veldron Academy," he said, and his voice carried the calm authority of someone who had been waiting for this moment his entire life. As of this hour, the Academy is under the direct authority of the Ascendancy Reborn, a movement of true Drenari patriots acting in coordination with fleet elements across the Union. The Civilian Council has failed this galaxy and the age of weakness is over. You will comply or you will be dealt with. The coup had begun, and it was not just Veldron. Across the galaxy at the same hour, Drenari military officers loyal to a faction that called itself the Ascendancy Reborn, seized control of 14 Union installations, 3 orbital defense platforms, and the entire communications relay network for the inner systems. And at the center of it all was Admiral Kalun, Voroth's father, who broadcast a declaration of military authority from the bridge of the Union flagship that he had commandeered with the help of officers who had been placed in key positions over the course of a decade. It was the largest coordinated military action the Galactic Union had ever faced from within its own ranks. On Veldron, the Academy fell in minutes. Commandant Ulvaris was pulled from his office by 4 armed Drenari and forced to his knees in the main corridor. And the look on his face was one of genuine shock, because for all his political compromises and buried reports, he had never imagined that the rot went this deep. And now it was too late for imagination to matter. Instructors who resisted were stunned with pulse weapons and dragged to holding cells, and Instructor Dole, the Menari veteran who had called Rios exceptional, took a shot to the chest that left him breathing but unconscious on the floor of his own classroom. Non-Drenari cadets were rounded up with brutal efficiency and confined to the lower barracks under armed guard, packed into rooms designed for 20 with numbers closer to 60. And the guards made it clear with their weapons and their silence that asking questions was not advisable. The Terran cadets were handled differently. Vorath came to them personally in the barracks, where the 5 of them had been gathered, and he stood in the doorway with his tusks catching the amber light and his sidearm on his hip, and he looked at them with something that was almost respect. "Terrans," he said, "you are warriors. We know this. The Ascendancy has no quarrel with your kind. Swear loyalty to the new order, and you will serve as honored allies in the force we are building." The 5 Terran cadets looked at each other. A young man named Cadet Reeves, 22 years old, and built like a weapon someone had covered in skin, spoke for the group. "No," he said. Vorath tilted his head. "You understand what refusal means." "We understand," Reeves said. "The answer is still no." They were locked in a sealed compartment in the engineering sublevel, with magnetic locks on the door and 2 armed guards outside. And Vorath dismissed them from his mind, because 5 unarmed humans in a locked room were not a strategic concern. But there should have been 6 Terrans in that room. Vorath did not notice. His lieutenants did not notice. And the manifest check that should have caught the discrepancy was handled by a junior officer who was too busy with the chaos of the coup to count heads twice. Sarah Torres was not in the barracks when the roundup happened. She had not been in the barracks since the night she carried Rios to the medical bay, because in the 3 days since that night, she had spent every free hour in the maintenance sublevels of the station, doing something that no one had authorized and no one had observed. She was mapping every access tunnel, every ventilation shaft, every emergency bulkhead control, every junction box and power relay and atmospheric processor on the station. She walked them all with a datapad borrowed from the engineering lab, and she recorded everything with the careful attention of someone who was not preparing for an inspection, but preparing for a war. She did not know a coup was coming, but Sarah Torres had grown up on a colony world where the border conflicts had taught every child the same lesson. When the system fails, you don't wait for it to fix itself. You learn the ground under your feet, and you prepare for the moment when preparation is the only thing standing between you and the dark. So when the amber lights came on, and Vorath's voice filled the corridors, Sarah was 3 levels below the main deck, in a maintenance crawl space with a stolen security access chip in one hand, and a complete map of the station's infrastructure on her datapad. And she listened to the broadcast, and she closed her eyes, and she breathed. Then she opened her eyes and started moving. But before she moved, she needed to know one thing, and she found it by patching into an internal security feed through a junction box that the coup forces had not thought to lock down, because it was labeled as a waste management relay. She saw the main assembly hall, She saw the cadets lined up under armed guard, and she saw Rios. They had dragged him from the medical bay, still bandaged, still healing, his upper arms in stabilizing wraps, and they had pinned him to the wall again, this time in the center of the assembly hall where every cadet in the academy could see him. And Vorath stood beside him like a hunter standing beside a trophy, and addressed the crowd. "This is the natural order," Vorath said. His voice echoed through the hall and through the security feed into the crawl space where Sarah crouched in the dark. The strong lead, the weak serve, and those who forget their place are reminded. This creature thought it could command Drenari. Look at it now, and remember. Rios hung from the wall with his eyes open, and his face empty of everything except a pain that had gone past the point where it could be expressed. And the cadets in the hall looked at him, and some of them wept quietly, and some of them stared at the floor, and all of them understood that this was not just cruelty. It was a statement of power. Sarah watched the feed for 11 seconds. She counted. Later, when they asked her why she counted, she said it was because she needed to be sure that what she was feeling was not rage. Because rage makes you stupid, and stupid gets people killed. And after 11 seconds, she was sure that what she was feeling was something colder and cleaner than rage. It was purpose. She closed the feed and pulled up her map and began marking targets. The communications array, the armory ventilation system, the security camera network, the sealed compartment where her fellow Terrans were being held. And she marked each one with a small red dot and drew lines between them in an order that represented not a plan, but a sequence of things that were going to happen. Because Vorath had made one mistake that all tyrants eventually make. He had counted his enemies and decided that none of them mattered. And he had forgotten to count the Terran, who was already inside the walls. The external communications array, on Veldron, was located on the upper ring of the station, behind 3 layers of security doors and a dedicated guard post. And it was the lifeline that connected Vorath and his cadets to Admiral Kalen's fleet, and to the other Ascendancy Reborn cells across the galaxy. And without it, they were deaf and blind and alone. Sarah did not go to the upper ring. She went to Deck 7, Maintenance Section 14, where a bundle of primary data conduits ran through a crawl space that was 18 inches wide and filled with heat from the relay processors. And she squeezed herself through that crawl space on her belly for 40 meters, until she reached the junction where the communications array drew its signal feed. She disconnected 4 cables. She rerouted 2 others into a feedback loop that would make the system report itself as operational while actually sending every outgoing signal into empty space. Total time from entry to completion. Exit, 9 minutes. On the command level, a Drenari technician noticed a brief flicker on his communications board and ran a diagnostic that came back clean, and he reported to Vorath that systems were nominal. They were not nominal. The second thing Sarah killed was their teeth. The main armory on Veldron held enough weapons to outfit 3 full battalions, and the coup forces had seized it in the first minutes of the takeover and posted 6 armed guards outside the main entrance. And those guards were confident and alert and watching every approach corridor with the discipline of soldiers who knew the armory was the key to everything. Sarah went to the ventilation control room on Deck 4. The armory had its own sealed air supply for safety reasons, which meant it had its own intake vents, which meant those intake vents had manual override valves that were accessible from the ventilation control room. And Sarah opened the coolant bypass on the station's secondary thermal regulation system and redirected the output into the armory's air supply. Industrial coolant gas is not toxic, but it displaces oxygen very efficiently, and it drops the temperature of an enclosed space to near freezing in under 2 minutes. The guards heard the hissing first, and then felt the cold, and then could not breathe. They evacuated the armory in a stumbling rush of fog and panic, and by the time they cleared the corridor and sealed the door behind them, Sarah had already locked the armory from the ventilation control room, using an emergency contamination protocol that required command-level clearance to override. Vorath did not have command-level clearance, because Commandant Ulvaris had never given it to him, and the system did not care about coups. The guards reported the armory breach, and Vorath sent a team to open it, and the team spent 45 minutes trying to bypass the lock, before concluding that they would need to cut through the door, which would take hours they did not have. The third thing Sarah gave back was the truth. The security camera network on Veldran had been one of the first things the coup forces disabled. They shut down recording and redirected all feeds to a single monitoring station that they controlled. But the underlying system was still intact, because shutting it down completely would have required physical access to 9 different server nodes spread across the station. Sarah had physical access to 7 of them. She visited each one in sequence through the maintenance tunnels, spending no more than 3 minutes at each node, and at each one she did the same thing. She bypassed the redirect and restored the original feed. And then she patched that feed into the station's emergency broadcast transmitter, which was designed to send distress signals to the Galactic Union's emergency response network, and which operated on a frequency that the coup forces had not thought to block, because it was supposed to be a passive system that only activated during hull breaches. She activated it, and suddenly the galaxy was watching. Every Union monitoring station, every emergency response center, every newsfeed that tracked military distress signals, they all received the same images at the same time. 100 cadets from a dozen species kneeling on the floor of an assembly hall under armed guard, instructors bleeding in holding cells, and at the center of it all, a young Salvarii with 4 broken arms pinned to a wall like a specimen in a museum, while a Drenari with tusks stood beside him and smiled. The footage spread across the galaxy in minutes, and it spread the way fire spreads, not gradually, but everywhere at once. The fourth thing Sarah freed was her people. The sealed compartment where the 5 Terran cadets were being held was on the engineering sublevel, behind a magnetic lock with 2 guards. It, from below, through an access panel in the floor that opened into a utility space directly beneath the compartment. She cut through the floor plating with a plasma torch she had taken from a maintenance locker, and dropped into the room like something out of a nightmare that the 2 guards outside never saw coming. Reeves looked at her with an expression that was half relief and half something that Terrans do not have a proper word for. The feeling you get when you realize that someone on your side has been fighting while you were locked in a box. "How long have you been at this?" he asked. "A while," she said. She gave them the layout, the positions of every guard she had mapped, the status of the communications and the armory and the cameras. And then she said, "No weapons, we do this with the station. Bulkheads and gravity controls and atmosphere locks. Make them afraid of every door and every corridor." The Terrans spread out into the station like water, finding cracks in stone. And on the command level, Vorath began to notice that something was wrong. A door that should have opened did not open. A corridor that should have been clear was sealed by a bulkhead that had activated without authorization. A guard post reported hearing movement in the walls, and then reported nothing at all, because their communications went dead mid-sentence. Vorath called for the armory team and got no response, because the armory team was still cutting through a door that would not yield. He called for the fleet and got silence, because his signals were going nowhere. He called for a security sweep of the maintenance levels, and the team he sent came back 12 minutes later with wide eyes and the report that the Terrans were loose, all of them, and they were everywhere and nowhere, and the station itself seemed to be working against the coup. Vorath stood in the assembly hall with 12 armed cadets around him, and Rios still hanging on the wall behind him, and he was, for the first time in his life, uncertain. And then the main door of the assembly hall opened. Sarah Torres walked through it alone. She was not armed. Her uniform was dirty from hours of crawling through maintenance tunnels, and her hands were black with grease. and her hair had come loose from its tie and hung around her face, and she walked into a room full of armed Drenari soldiers, as if she were walking into a classroom. She stopped 10 meters from Vorath, and she looked at him, and then she looked past him at Rios on the wall, and her jaw tightened once, and then relaxed. "Your communications are dead," she said, and her voice was not loud, but it carried, because she had patched into the assembly hall speaker system from the maintenance level 3 minutes before walking through the door, and every room on the station heard her. "Your armory is sealed, your guards are scattered, and every emergency response center in the galaxy is watching what you are doing right now through the cameras you forgot to actually disable." She paused. "The Union emergency fleet received my signal 2 hours ago, and they are 12 minutes away. And when they get here, they will find the footage of what you did to that boy on the wall. And so will every court, and every council, and every citizen in the Galactic Union." Vorath's tusks ground together. "You are one human. You are unarmed. You are in a room with 12 soldiers. What exactly do you think is going to happen?" Sarah looked at the 12 soldiers. 3 of them were already shifting their weight in the way that soldiers shift when they are reconsidering their position, because they had heard the broadcasts, and they had seen the doors seal, and they had felt the station turn against them, and they knew what Terrans were capable of, because everyone knew, and this particular Terran had walked through the front door by choice. Which meant, either she was insane, or she knew something they did not. "What is going to happen," Sarah said, "is that you are going to stand down, and you are going to release that cadet from the wall, and you are going to wait for the fleet to arrive and answer for what you have done." Vorath drew his sidearm. "Or I kill you right here." "You can try," Sarah said, "and it will be the last thing you do on camera before the entire galaxy watches you murder an unarmed woman, and your father's movement dies tonight, not as a revolution, but as a crime." Vorath screamed and charged. The fight lasted 14 seconds. Vorath was bigger and stronger and faster in a straight line, and he swung at her with a force that could have broken a bulkhead. But Sarah was not standing where the swing landed, because Terran combat training does not teach you to match strength with strength. It teaches you to be somewhere else and to make the other person pay for missing. Redirected his momentum into the floor. She broke his right tusk with an elbow strike that she drove upward with her entire body weight. She took a hit to the ribs that cracked 2 of them, and she did not slow down. And she put him on the ground with a joint lock that used his own mass against him until he was face down on the deck, with her knee on his spine, and his arm bent at an angle that was 1 degree from breaking. "Stay down," she said. He stayed down. 3 of his cadets dropped their weapons, and then 5 more, and then the rest, because the thing about fear is that it works in both directions, and the fear in that room had just changed owners. Sarah stood up and walked past Vorath's body to the wall where Rios hung, and she pulled out the same multi-tool she had used 3 days ago, and she cut the clamps one by one, and for the second time she caught him as he fell. "I told you," Rios whispered. "They would come for you." They did, and here I am. 12 minutes later the Union fleet arrived. The Union fleet came out of faster-than-light travel in a formation that filled the viewport of every window on Veldron. 27 warships arranged in a crescent that the Drenari called the Jaw of Judgment, and that every species in the galaxy understood to mean the same thing. This is over. They boarded the Academy within the hour, and the Drenari cadets who had held the station surrendered without resistance because the fight had already left them. Not when the fleet arrived, but when a single Terran woman had walked through the front door and taken their leader apart with her bare hands while the galaxy watched. Across the wider conflict, the Ascendancy Reborn collapsed in a chain reaction that military historians would later describe as the fastest self-destruction of a coup in recorded galactic history. And the reason was simple: the footage from Veldron. Every world saw it. Every species saw it. They saw a young HFY cadet with 4 dislocated arms, pinned to a wall, like a piece of cargo, while armed soldiers stood around him and called it strength. And they saw the faces of the other cadets who had been forced to watch. And they saw the fear in those faces. And something inside the collective conscience of the galaxy shifted in a way that could not be shifted back. Admiral Kalun was arrested on the bridge of the flagship he had stolen, and the officers who had followed him suddenly found that their conviction had evaporated in the light of what the cameras had shown. Because it is one thing to believe in the supremacy of your kind when you are surrounded by people who agree with you, and it is another thing entirely to believe it when 100 billion beings across 1,000 worlds have just watched you pin a child to a wall. The Ascendancy Reborn had wanted to be seen as liberators. Instead, they were seen as what they were. The Academy was placed under direct Union administration within a week, and teams of investigators arrived to document everything: the planning, the weapons, the network of officers who had been placed in positions of power over the course of years. And the scope of what they found made it clear that Veldron had been intended as the heart of a new military government, a symbol of Drenari dominance that would have reshaped the galaxy if it had succeeded. Commandant Alvarez cooperated fully with the investigation, and he was not charged because he had not been part of the conspiracy, but the weight of what had happened under his command sat on his shoulders like a physical thing. And when he met with Sarah Torres in his office 3 days after the liberation, he looked like a man who had aged a decade in a week. "I owe you a debt," he said, "one that I cannot repay." Sarah sat across from him in a chair that was too large for a human, and she looked at him with those gray eyes that had not changed since the day she arrived. "Do not repay it to me. Repay it to every Selvari cadet who walked these halls and was treated as less than a person while you signed reports and looked the other way." Alvarez flinched. "That is not a kindness," he said. "No," Sarah said, "it is not." She stood and left his office and did not look back. Vorath Kalin was tried before a Union military tribunal, along with 37 other cadets and officers who had participated in the coup on Veldron, and the trial was broadcast on the same channels that had carried the footage of Rios on the wall, because the Union understood that justice must be seen to be done if it is to mean anything. The evidence was overwhelming, and the verdicts were unanimous, and Vorath was sentenced to 40 years in a rehabilitation facility on a station at the edge of known space. And when the sentence was read, he stood with his broken tusk and his golden eyes, and he said nothing, because there was nothing left to say. Image that defined the trial was not a weapon or a document or a confession. It was a photograph taken from the security feed of a Selvari boy hanging from a wall with his arms spread and his blood on the floor. And that photograph was printed and distributed and displayed in government buildings and military academies across the galaxy as a reminder of what happens when power is allowed to operate without conscience. Rios Velen recovered. His arms were repaired through 3 separate surgical procedures that used regenerative technology from 4 different species. And the doctors told him that he would regain full function, but that the nerve damage would leave a tremor in his lower left hand that might never fully go away. And Rios looked at his trembling fingers and said, "That is fine." The Union offered him a transfer to any posting in the galaxy, a quiet way of removing him from the Academy and the memories it held. And Rios considered it for exactly 1 moment. "Day before refusing, I will graduate from this Academy," he said. "In this hall, from this program, and I will do it because no one gets to take that from me." He returned to his classes the following week, and when he walked into the tactical theory classroom, every cadet in the room stood up, not because they were ordered to, but because something in them understood that standing was the correct thing to do. Instructor Dahl, recovered from his injuries and back at his post with a new scar across his chest, watched from the front of the room and said nothing. But the look in his eyes said everything. 6 months after the coup, Sarah Torres was summoned before the Galactic Union Military Council, a body of 12 senior officers and representatives from the founding species of the Union, who sat in a curved chamber on the capital world, and who had the authority to shape the policy of every military force in known space. Commendation. They also wanted to understand her. The council chamber was enormous, and Sarah stood at the center of it in her dress uniform, with her scarred knuckles visible at her sides, and her gray eyes steady, and the council members looked down at her from their elevated seats, like scientists examining something they were not sure they could classify. An elder of the Tarathi, a species that had existed for 10,000 years and had seen empires rise and fall like tides, leaned forward and asked the question that everyone in the chamber wanted to ask. "Cadet Torres," he said, and his voice was like wind moving through ancient stone. "You were under no obligation to act. The Salvari are not your people. This was not your war. You had every reason to remain hidden and wait for the fleet. And instead, you dismantled a military coup from the inside and walked unarmed into a room full of enemies. I must ask you, why?" Chamber waited. Then she said, "Because he was pinned to a wall, and everyone else walked past." The elder stared at her. The silence in the chamber lasted for 5 full seconds, which is a very long time when 12 of the most powerful beings in the galaxy are all thinking the same thought at the same time. Then the elder turned to his colleagues and said in a voice that was barely above a whisper, but carried clearly through the chamber, "Now you understand why the Terrans frighten me." Sarah was awarded the Union Cross of Valor, the highest military honor that can be given to a non-citizen of the founding species, and she was the first Terran ever to receive it. And when they placed the medal on her chest, she did not smile, because Sarah Torres was not the kind of person who smiled at medals. She was the kind of person who smiled at people. And the person she smiled at was Rios Valen, who was sitting in the gallery of the council chamber with his 4 arms folded across his chest, all 4 of them working, the lower left trembling only slightly, and who smiled back. Years passed. Rios graduated from the academy with the highest tactical scores in its history, and was commissioned as a Union fleet officer. And over the following decade, he rose through the ranks with a speed that had nothing to do with politics, and everything to do with the fact that he was exactly as brilliant as Instructor Dahl had always said he was. He became a fleet commander at 31, the youngest in Union history, and the first Salvari to ever hold the rank. And his tactical record was studied at every military academy in the galaxy. And he kept a single image on his desk, in a simple frame. A photograph of a young Terran woman, with dark hair and scarred knuckles, and calm gray eyes, cutting a magnetic clamp with a multi-tool. And in the image, her face showed no anger and no fear, just the quiet, steady look of someone doing something that needed to be done. Sarah Torres was never promoted beyond the rank of commander. She did not play politics well, and she had a habit of telling people in power exactly what she thought of them, which is a habit that Terrans are known for, and which does not help with promotions, but she did not seem to mind. What she did was teach. She became the most requested instructor at the rebuilt Veldron Academy, and every cycle on the first day of training, she stood before a hall full of new cadets from every species in the galaxy, and she said the same words. "In this academy, no one gets pinned to a wall, and no one walks past. Are we clear?" And the cadets answered together, in a voice that shook the walls, "Clear, Commander." And it was enough. And across the galaxy, in embassy halls and military briefing rooms, and the quiet corners of stations where old soldiers told stories to young ones, a new saying took root, in 100 languages, among the species who remembered what happened on Veldron. A saying that was not a threat and not a warning, but something closer to a truth that the galaxy had learned the hard way. Never pin someone to the wall when a Terran is watching, because a Terran will not look away. A Terran will not walk past. A Terran will cut you free and carry you through the main concourse and leave a trail of blood on the floor so that everyone can see. And then a Terran will go into the dark and take your whole world apart with nothing but a multi-tool and a decision. And by the time you realize what is happening, it will already be too late. Because that is what humans do. That is what humans remember. And the galaxy would never forget it.